G'day everyone. I've been away over the festive period visiting my parents, and I have recently returned and just trying to get back into the swing of making videos and going to work again. I've got some pictures here in the background for your perusal, where you can see my parents' farm. Anyhow, I'd just like to thank everyone for the response to my December video late last year. It was quite surprising to see just how many people actually viewed it and how many subscribers I got. I was completely blown away. Thanks very much to everyone who watched it and everyone who left a comment. Moving on to today's video. With last year feeling very much like a dumpster fire, I thought I'd pick a game that sort of reflected how many of us felt about 2020. So today I'm playing post-apocalyptic Petra, which was actually made during a time where many of us were in lockdown early last year, from about February to May, by a guy called Bad Sector. It's a very impressive 3D platforming game made for MS-DOS, but also for Windows and 3D accelerated Windows, which is really quite impressive given the short time frame. The software-rendered visual style kind of reminds me of games like Tomb Raider that came out in the late 90s. Although it looks like Tomb Raider to a degree, it's much simpler than that. Obviously being made by one person in a short time frame, he couldn't possibly add all of the features in that a full commercial game has. But it does do platforming puzzling very well. Basically, your goal is to guide Petra through the levels to escape the facility where she has been asleep for some time. We don't really know much about the outside world, only that there's a computer guiding us. Its name is Lord. The computer tells us that we're the last one left alive in the facility, and that it's been told to wake us and get us out of the facility by someone. It has trouble figuring out who, though, or how it was told. The facility you're in has quite clearly been sitting abandoned for quite some time, as many of the systems are damaged or missing parts. So Petra has to find a way around these problems, either by finding spare parts, or finding another way around where things are broken. Petra herself will tell you what some of the problems are and possible solutions, but you'll also find these data disks around the levels that will contain messages from people who used to live in the facility before it was abandoned. Some of these messages are just there for fun and a little bit of lore, but many of them also contain things like door codes and locations where you'll find things that you may need. So if you find a data disk, it's a good idea to take it to a computer in order to read it. You'll need to make sure you fully explore all the levels to find all the key items you need to solve the problems. Petra is fairly agile, quite like Lara Croft, in that she can jump quite some distance and also grab onto ledges and shuffle along them. Whilst the platforming isn't all that difficult, you will need this agility to be able to get into some areas that are more hidden. The puzzles are, of course, where the main meat of this game is. Some of them are quite difficult, but quite doable. It just takes some thought and following all of the clues to their logical conclusion. That turns out to be trickier for some of them than others, particularly in the last level, where you have to piece together a door code from a number of clues. Whilst I did get stuck a few times, the puzzles are, for the most part, fairly well constructed. On the technical side of things, Bad Sector has done a very good job of making a software renderer that works quite well even on older DOS systems. The capture I've got here in the background is from a Pentium 200MHz MMX. You could probably run it on a slower machine, but it's not optimized well enough to really run on, say, a 486, for instance. If you don't happen to have an old MS-DOS machine, there's also several Windows versions available, some of which are hardware accelerated, but there's also a software rendered version. These all play significantly better than the DOS version, obviously, because you can run them on modern hardware. But this also makes the game more accessible to people who don't actually own an old DOS machine. If you do happen to own an old DOS machine, you'll want one that has a Sound Blaster 16 in it, as that is the only sound card that Petra supports. The sound is actually quite good. It mostly has atmospheric sound that sort of comes from parts of the environment, and also Petra's footsteps. This makes the levels feel very atmospheric, and you could almost say post-apocalyptic. There's no one to interact with, and with very little other sounds apart from the environment, it does feel quite lonely. Of course, for this game, that is totally appropriate. Much like older DOS games, you can play this entirely with the keyboard, but there is a keyboard and mouse option if you'd prefer. I played with the keyboard only, just basically because I didn't have a mouse handy on my DOS machine, and it actually played okay. But the main problem I had was lining Petra up with things like buttons and the computer terminals. So I think the hotspots for activating terminals and buttons could be a little bit larger, just to make it a bit easier to activate them. The only other real criticism I have of Petra is that in many areas it was just too dark to see well enough on my hardware, and I had to really sort of jack up the gamma on my capture system just to make it visible all that well at all. I think the best way to make this better would have been to include some gamma correction controls. I don't really have a problem with there being dark areas, it's just that across the different machines I had, you had very different experiences depending on what screen and what type of output you were using, whether it was hardware accelerated or software rendered. And on my DOS machine it was particularly dark. This made it pretty difficult to do some exploring that I really needed to do in the first level, and I got stuck there for quite a while just because I couldn't find my way around in the dark. Once I got around that though, it was much easier. Gamma problems aside, I really enjoyed playing post-apocalyptic Petra. It presented perplexing puzzles that had me pondering the best solution. I did manage to get all the way through the game. It takes roughly about half an hour if you know exactly what you're doing. But obviously this will be longer on your first playthrough as you learn where everything is. Being as short as it is, it could use some more content, perhaps in the form of a second episode or something like that, but it is pretty good as it is, and I'd say you probably should give it a try. I'll link the author's website in the description below. I hope you enjoyed today's video about post-apocalyptic Petra. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time.